Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to AJ 112 Introduction to Criminology. My name is Tony Farrar, and of course, I am your instructor for this semester. Tonight's lecture is going to be on Chapter 10, Violent Crime, and I may break it up into two lectures or I'll keep it in one. It's just going to be longer, so bear with me as I get through a lot of this information. With that said, we're going to jump right into it. We'll talk about the learning objectives. We're going to look at various causes of violent crime. We're going to define what rape is because the section has actually changed, and be familiar with why individuals commit this type of crime. We're going to analyze different types of murder. Also look at some different patterns of robbery and the nature of robbery. And then finally, we'll look at some other emerging forms of criminal violence like stalking, hate crime, and even workplace violence. So we're going to jump right into it because we do have so much to cover. One question that comes to mind for me every time I study a chapter on violent crime, I always ask myself who killed Tupac and Biggie, because that's a very interesting case in itself. And if you don't have if you have time, there are a couple of specials that were on TV not too long ago that went over this particular case, and it's very, very interesting. But that brings us to fact or fiction, because we do this every chapter to get your brain stimulated and kind of going. So fact or fiction, rape is only a sex crime. Interesting concept, and again, we'll talk more about the section, the penal code section that defines that, along with why individuals do that. And then secondly, fact or fiction, you cannot be convicted of murder unless you personally and intentionally kill someone. So while this isn't a criminal law class, it should make you think of, are there other avenues to where you could be convicted of murder where you didn't personally or intentionally kill somebody. So our quick case study for this evening. On the evening of June 17th, 2015, 21-year-old Dylan Roof entered the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in downtown Charleston, South Carolina, spent about 1 hour in a Bible study with parishioners, and then subsequently opened fire. 9 people were shot and killed, including the senior pastor, State Senator Clementia Pinckney. A 10th person was shot but survived, and police arrested Roof in Shelby, North Carolina, the morning after the attack. And here you can see some photos of some of the weapons, etc., that he had in the back of his vehicle, along with him exiting the church. And you can see him in possession of a weapon as well. Now, Roof's website gave hints as to why he chose the Emmanuel Church for his unprovoked attack here. In a long, hate-filled rant, if you will, Roof claimed that the shooting of Trayvon Martin had prompted him to research what he called black-on-white crime. And he wrote, quote, "At this moment, I realized that something was very wrong. How could the news be blowing up at the Trayvon Martin case while hundreds of these black-on-white murders got ignored," end quote. And his online manifesto included a lot of information as well. So in 2017, Roof was sentenced to death after being convicted in federal court on 33 federal hate crime charges. So the question kind of comes into play when we talk about it, or when we think about this. This case reminds us that violence and violent acts are part of what we call the human condition. And some violent acts, such as Roof's deadly attack, are deemed expressive violence, which means that these acts they're venting rage and anger and frustration, and in this particular case, hate. And some acts are called instrumental violence. And these type of acts are designed to improve the finances or social position of the criminal, like an armed robbery or a murder for hire. So hopefully you can kind of differentiate between the two of those. So what sets off a violent person such as Dylan Roof, criminologists, they have a variety of views on the subject. And what we want to do tonight is explore the concept of violence in some depth, and review some of the possible causes of violent crime and the various types of interpersonal violence, such as rape and homicide, assault and robbery, and then address some types of interpersonal violence like stalking and workplace violence, some things that have become a little bit more, I kind of hate to say it, but contemporary in the realm of criminality. So again, what sets off a violent person such as Dylan Roof? Well, criminologists have a variety of views on the subject, and some believe that violence is a function of human traits and makeup. Others point to improper socialization and upbringing. Violent behavior may be culturally determined and relate to destructive social values. So again, what we're going to talk about a little bit, we're going to explore kind of a number of suspected causes of individual and group violence. So, when you look at these two photos, you look at the one on the left, and the one on the right, maybe you don't know much about those types of issues, but, or what the pictures actually, what homicide they came from, if you will. But what are some of the causes of this? What would cause people to yank somebody out of a truck, like you see in the picture on the left, which was during the Rodney King riots, and basically beat them almost to death? And then what would cause someone to commit such calculated violence as maybe that you would see on the photo on the right? And are there underlying tones that you can glean from each one of these? And you can see the photos are a little bit bigger here to give you a kind of a better picture, if you will. So now let's look at some personal traits. So while mental illness is only weakly related to violence, and weakly meaning like not strong but weak, okay, other psychological and personal traits may have greater impacts. And research has shown that a significant number of people involved in violent episodes may be suffering from mental abnormalities. Young people convicted of murder have been shown to suffer signs of neurological impairment, such as abnormal, EEGs, multiple psychomotor impairments, and even severe seizures. Low intelligence as measured on standard IQ test, psychotic close relatives, psychotic symptoms such as paranoia, illogical thinking, hallucinations, mental impairment, and intellectual dysfunction, and animal cruelty. And other elements of personality associated with violence include things like depression, or impulsivity, or aggression, or dishonesty, or pathological lying, lack of remorse, borderline personality syndrome, and even psychopathy. Aggressive men have been found to have a long history of torturing and killing animals, and animal cruelty has been associated with a large number of psychiatric disorders, including antisocial personality behavior. So again, we see that research has shown that a large number of people involved in violent episodes might be suffering from other types of things. And here again, we're talking about personal traits. Now, one note just to kind of bring out again, to rehash, aggressive men have been found to have a long history of torturing and killing animals, and this really has been associated with a number of psychiatric disorders. Moving on, again, another possible cause of violence. Now remember, not one of them just, is like set in stone that means that somebody's going to become some kind of psychopath, but these are different causes of violence. So there are also indications that children who are subject to all forms of childhood emotional and physical abuse may be more likely to one day use violence themselves. It doesn't mean they're going to, it just means that they could be. And this can include things like emotional abuse or physical abuse or sexual abuse or emotional neglect, um, physical neglect, and even observations of domestic violence. So all of these things can attribute to that. Now, sociologist Murray Strauss reviewed the concept of discipline in a series of surveys and found a powerful relationship between the exposure to physical punishment and later aggression. So, we know now that the more often a child is physically disciplined and the harsher that particular discipline or punishment, the more likely that they may or will later engage in some type of antisocial behavior. And in addition to that, in a series of research studies, criminologist Kathy Whitem identified what is known as the cycle of violence, in which physical abuse by parents or caretakers is a direct cause of subsequent violent behavior among youth. And kids who were abused are then likely to grow up to be abusers themselves, creating kind of a never-ending cycle of abuse and violence. They are significantly more likely to be arrested for violent crime sometime during their life course. And again, the name of that is called the cycle of violence. And this is, again, a hypothesis that suggests that a childhood history of physical abuse predisposes the survivor to becoming violent themselves in later years. Another sub-cause of violence could be human instinct. Some anthropologists trace the roots of violence back to our prehistory, when our ancestors lived in social groups and actually fought for dominance. The earliest humans would not hesitate to retaliate violently against aggressors, and it was common for family, tribe, or clan members to protect one another if they were attacked. So kind of an interesting theory here. And according to Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker, violence declined during the period of human evolution when our hunter-gatherer ancestors began to settle into agriculture civilizations. So this was actually called something. It was called the pacification process, but I wanted you to understand kind of where this came from. And on a more famous side, Sigmund Freud, which we could talk about forever and may not even understand it, believed that human aggression and violence was produced by instinctual drives. And Freud maintained that humans possess two opposing drives that interact to control behavior. And that's the eros, that talks about the life instinct, which drives people towards self-fulfillment and enjoyment, and the Thanatos instinct, if you will, the death instinct, which impels towards self-destruction. And Thanatos can be expressed externally as violence, or internally as things like suicide, alcoholism, or other self-destructing type behavior or habits. And because aggression is instinctual, Freud saw little hope for its treatment in that particular area. Another subheading, if you will, under causes would be exposure to violence. So people who are constantly exposed to violence at home, at school, or in the environment may adopt violent methods themselves. In disadvantaged neighborhoods, for instance, people of all ages are exposed to violence on a more routine basis. And much of the racial difference in violent crime rates can be explained by the fact that African American citizens are often forced to live in poverty areas, which increases their risk of exposure to violence. And areas where people have little confidence in the police and are therefore reluctant to call for help, a condition common in some communities, may also experience higher levels of violent behavior. So just the exposure could actually desensitize someone. Even a Single exposure to firearm violence doubles the chance that a young person will later engage in violent behavior. And again, children living in areas marked by violence may become desensitized, meaning that it's something that happens all the time, so they don't think of it as some kind of big deal, like you and I might think of it, or someone that's never been exposed to it. And you can see it on the news, and I've got some clips here or photos of different, news broadcasts. And this helps, everybody, after you see this a lot, you tend to be a little bit desensitized to the impact that it might have. Another cause of violence could be substance abuse. So on a micro level or smaller level, substance abusers have higher rates of violence than non-abusers. On a macro level, neighborhoods with higher levels of drug and alcohol usage have a higher than average violence rates. And substance abuse influences violence in 3 different ways. First is the psychopharmacological relationship. Next is the economic compulsive behavior. And the last is the systematic link. And let me kind of explain that. So a psychopharmacological relationship may be the direct consequence of ingesting, let's say, mood-altering substances. Like binge drinking, for example, has been closely associated with violent crimes. Heavy drinking reduces cognitive ability, information processing skills, and the ability to process and react to verbal and nonverbal behavior. So, maybe that's why we have maybe more bar fights or actions where people are intoxicated or under the influence. So again, kind of an interesting concept here, and this is the psychopharmacological. Under the economic one, drug ingestion may also cause economic compulsive behavior, in which drug users resort to violence to support their habit. And studies conducted in the United States and Europe show that addicts commit hundreds of crimes each year. So the fact that you've become a drug addict, it's going to become an economic issue when you can no longer afford to support your habit and you have to turn to crime in order to do that. So hopefully that makes sense. And also, and showing you some different photos here, when you talk about substance abuse and things like that, sometimes it's not just criminal in action. We do crazy things when we're under the influence of different types of things. And then finally, the systematic link. A systematic link occurs as violence escalates when, let's say, drug dealing gangs flex their muscle to dominate territory and drive out the rivals. Studies of gangs that sell drugs show that their violent activities may result in a significant proportion of all urban homicides. So drug dealers are also more likely to carry and use firearms in their daily lives. Now, when Richard Felson and Luke Bonkiewicz studied the drug violence nexus, they found relatively high levels of gun possession among traffickers who handle stashes of moderately large market value, who have central roles in the trade, and who are members of drug organizations. So that's the systematic link, if you will. Another sub-cause or cause of violence could be firearm availability. Now, although firearm availability alone does not cause violence, and we're not going to do the big debate on that tonight, it may be a facilitating factor. A petty argument can escalate into a fatal encounter if one party has a handgun. The nation has also been rocked by the recent slew of well-publicized school shootings, and research indicates that a significant number of children routinely carry guns to school. Those who have been the victims of crime themselves and those who hang with peers who carry weapons are most likely to bring guns to school. So along with that, the Uniform Crime Report, or the UCR is what they call it for short, indicates that about 70% of all murders And 40% of all robberies and 24% of aggravated assaults involve firearms. Handguns kill 2/3 of all police who die in the line of duty. And the presence of firearms in the home is also significantly increases the risk of suicide among adolescents, regardless of how carefully those guns are stored or put away. And again, we're not going to do the gun debate, but it is interesting to know that the firearm availability can contribute. Whether or not you believe it's the factor itself, hey, that's fine. But we're just trying to get the point across here that it can facilitate or even contribute. Next would be cause of violence could be cultural. In urban areas, neighborhoods that experience violence seem to kind of cluster together. To explain this phenomenon, if you will, criminologists Marvin Wolfgang and Franco Furcuti formulated the famous concept that some areas are characterized by what they call a independent subculture of violence. And in this subculture, a potent theme of violence influences lifestyles, the socialization process, and even interpersonal relationships. In some cultural subgroups, then, the violence has become legitimized by, let's say, customs and norms. In these areas, people pretty much do not kill because they're poor, young, or live in a socially disadvantaged neighborhood, but rather because they live in a culture that maintains norms conducive to violent retaliation. It is considered appropriate behavior within a culturally defined conflict situation in which an individual who has been offended by a negative outcome in a dispute seeks reparation through a violent means. That is, in some neighborhoods, residents resolve internal conflicts informally without even calling the police, even if it means injuring or killing the other person. So, you could use gangs again as an example here. It's very routine to join gangs. And because of some of that, you're going to be put into that subculture where violence is a part of that particular culture. Well, what about maybe something a little bit larger? Talking about cultural values. What about like national values? Well, some nations, including, let's say, Colombia, Brazil, Sri Lanka, Angola, Uganda, and even the Philippines, have relatively high violence rate, while others, such as Japan, are relatively non-violent. And there are two possible explanations for this particular discrepancy. One is that high violence nations embrace value structures that support violence, while others have a strong communitarian spirit and an emphasis on forgiveness and restorative justice. Those have lower violence rates. And here you can look to, again, under explanation 2, a high level of poverty, income inequality, illiteracy, alcohol, and drug consumption. A lot of these can explain some different causes of violence. So now that we've kind of looked at some causes of violence, if you will, let's move into the next section, which talks about rape. And there's a lot of information. Again, I may break this up into a second chapter before we get into homicide, but we'll see how it goes. So the common law definition of rape, from the Latin word rapere, which is R-A-P-E-R-E, which means to take by force, is the carnal knowledge of a female forcibly and against their will. It is one of the most loathed, misunderstood, and frightening crimes. Now, under traditional common law definition, rape involves non-consensual sexual intercourse inflicted on a female by a male. There are, of course, other forms of sexual assault, including male on male and female on male sexual assaults. Some studies actually estimate that up to 25% of males have been the target of unwanted sexual advances by women, but these are not considered here within the traditional concept of rape. So criminologists now consider rape a violent, coercive act of aggression, not a forceful expression of sexuality in itself. Take, for instance, the use of rape in warfare, a practice that became routine during the Civil War in former Yugoslavia. Human rights groups have estimated that more than 30,000 Bosnian women and young girls were sexually abused during the fighting through shocking the war crimes discovered in Bosnia have not deterred conquering armies from using rape as a weapon. So, when you kind of look at it here, in May of 2014, a terrorist group by the name of Boko Haram, a group in Nigeria, kidnapped 276 high school girls, intending to sell them into slavery. And while 82 were released through negotiations, members of the Islamic State were given free hand to rape captured Yazidi women. And this is a religion that blends elements of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, after being told the rape would turn these women into Muslims. So there are these different factions there. So when we go back to fact or fiction and we talk about, rape as essentially a sex crime, most criminologists consider rape an aggressive act in which sex is merely a means of inflicting violence and intimidation. Now, it doesn't mean it couldn't just be sexual, but this is something that criminologists are looking into. And here's a photo from what I talked about from a CNN newscast regarding the Boko Haram. And what about the incidence of rape, the number? Well, according to most recent UCR data, and this is data that's collected by the FBI, an estimated 90,000 rapes are now being reported each year in the United States, a rate of almost 40 per 100,000 inhabitants. And as is true with other violent crimes, the incidence of rape, as reported in the UCR, was in a decade-long decline, and current totals are significantly below 1992 levels, when more than 100,000 rapes were reported to police. However, there has been a significant increase in the number of reported rapes over the past 2 years. It is still kind of early to tell whether this is the beginning of a long-term trend or a short-term kind of development. Now, victimization surveys, not just stats, indicate that rape is far more prevalent than what is recorded by the UCR. According to the National Crime Victimization Survey, more than 430,000 people were victims of rape and sexual assault during the last survey year, a significant increase over the prior survey. However, care should be taken in interpreting this change because the estimates of rape or sexual assault are based on a small number of cases reported to the survey. Therefore, small changes and fluctuations in the rates of victimization could have resulted in the very large year-to-year change estimates. But it's important that we ask ourselves, why is there such a big discrepancy? So there is no question that rape may be significantly underreported to police, and that there are significantly more victims than official data suggests. So the question we ask ourselves is, why the difference? And this, we can use this kind of as a thinking point. Sorry about that. The mailman is delivering some packages, and that's the doorbell ringing. But we talk about this thing called the dark figure of crime, and we'll use this iceberg as a metaphor. And what we see on top is what's reported to law enforcement, or what we know. The statistics through the FBI or even some information brought forth by surveys, etc. But what we have beneath the water is a much larger portion of the iceberg, if you will, and that's what we don't know. We don't know how big that portion really is, which means we don't know how many of these crimes are unreported and why were they not unreported. So hopefully that kind of makes sense regarding reporting figures, if you will. So when we talk about incidents of rape, we have to kind of also talk about patterns, and not just types, but patterns and trends, if you will. So rape is a warm weather crime because most incidents occur during July and August, with the lower rates occurring during, let's say, December, January, and February. Population density also influences the rape rate. Metropolitan areas today have rape rates significantly higher than rural, so big cities versus small little rural towns, if you will. Nonetheless, urban areas have experienced a much greater drop in rape than some of the rural areas. And the police make arrests in somewhat less than 40% of all reported rape offenses. The racial and age patterns of rape arrests have been fairly consistent for some time. Of the offenders arrested, the great majority were adults. About 2/3 were Caucasian. So when I ask these questions here and I gave you the information, we talk about, rape, and why does it occur more in warm weather and less in the colder weather times? And what does population density have to do with it? So again, thinking questions to kind of get you going. So now we're going to talk about the types, the different types. Some rapes are planned, whereas others are spontaneous, and some focus on a particular victim, whereas others occur almost as an afterthought during the commission of another crime, like a burglary. And some rapists commit a single crime, whereas others are multiple offenders, and some attack alone and others engage in group or gang rapes. Because there's no single type of rape or rapist, if you will, criminologists have attempted to define and categorize the vast variety of situations, if you will. So now that we know that there's these different types, if you will, we're starting to categorize them. So, criminologists now recognize that there are numerous motivations for rape, and consequently, we're putting them into various different categories. And some of the more infamous individuals you can see here that were rape and murderers would be Richard Ramirez, Ted Bundy, Russell Williams, and of course Gary Ridgway. And we're not going to go into every one of these, but I wanted you to kind of understand that we're starting to define different types. So one of the best known attempts to classify the personalities of rapists was that of Nicholas Groth, an expert in treating sex offenders. And according to Groth, every rape encounter contains at least one of three elements: anger, power, or sadism. And you can see the different percentages. And consequently, rapists can be classified according to one of the three dimensions that are described in your textbook, as listed right here. So again, anger rapists, power rapists, or sadist rapists. So with that being said, let's start to look at different types. So in addition to the variety of types of rapists, there are also different categories of rape, okay? So we have our type. And if you want a little bit more on the varieties, anger rape occurs when sexuality becomes a means of expressing and discharging pent-up anger and rage. The rapist uses far more brutality than would have been necessary if his real objective had simply been to have sex with the victim. And a power rape involves an attacker who does not want to harm his victim as much as he wants to possess his or her sexuality. And this person's goal is the sexual conquest. And he uses only the amount of force necessary to achieve the objective, and the power rapist wants to be in control and to dominate. And then the sadistic rape involves both sexuality and aggression. This sadistic rapist is bound up in ritual and may torment the victim and bind them up or torture them. And in the rapist view, victims are usually related to personal characteristics that the rapist wants to harm or destroy. So those are the varieties. And again, they're in your textbook on page 328 at the top. But now we're going to look at the different types. So we'll start with date rape. One disturbing trend involves people who are in some form of a courting relationship. And this type of attack, if you will, is called date rape. Some date rapes occur on the first dates, others after a relationship has begun developing, and still others after the couple has been involved for some time. In long-term or close relationships, the male partner may feel he has invested so much time and money in his partner that he is even owed, let's say, sexual relations, or that sexual intimacy is an expression or acknowledgement that the involvement is progressing. So by definition, a date rape involves people who are in some form of courting relationship. So sometimes, we'll continue on and we'll look at each one of these kind of individually. Another one that you might see could be or consider would be rape on campus. A great deal of date and acquaintance rape is committed on college campuses. The most extensive national survey of sexual assault on a college campus was conducted by Westat Research Corporation for the Association of American Universities. And the survey involved 150,000 students at 27 universities and found that by 2015, non-consensual sexual contact by physical force, threats of physical force, or incapacitation while enrolled at a university, about 12% of all students experienced misconduct, while the majority were female students, about 5% of male students reporting being sexually assaulted. So that's another type, would be college or campus rape. Another type could be marital rape. Traditionally, a legally married husband could not be charged with raping his wife. This immunity was referred to at that time the marital exception or exemption. However, research indicates that many women are raped each year by their husbands as part of an overall pattern of spousal abuse. And these women really do deserve the protection of the law. And the laws have changed a little bit on that as well. Another one could be statutory rape. So the term statutory rape refers to sexual relations between an underage minor, between one person being younger and one older. Now, typically, it's an underage minor female and an adult male, although, again, it's not gender specific. California, for example, has a written law, the Penal Code section is 261.5, that says that one individual is 18, so they're an adult, one individual is 17, so they're a minor, and sex between them, you can't consent when you're 17, therefore it is called statutory rape. So again, some states also have passed these laws called Romeo and Juliet laws that decriminalizes a sexual act that occurred between individuals with a few years age difference from being considered a criminal offense. But in California, we still have that on the books. There's also rape by deception, fraud, or trickery. This occurs when the rapist uses fraud or trickery to convince the victim to engage in sex or impersonate someone with whom the victim has been intimate with. In one Massachusetts case, a man was convicted of rape after allegedly impersonating his brother in order to have sex with his brother's girlfriend in the middle of the night. In another case, and I can't remember what state it was from, there was an individual that pretended to, he hired a fake priest to marry them so they weren't married, just so the individual could have sex with his so-called future wife. The wife thought that they were actually married so they could consummate the marriage, but they actually weren't. So these are actual situations of fraud or trickery. And then finally, sex and authority relations would be something like supervisor or similar. So a growing number of states have passed legislation making it a crime for people in power to have sexual relations with those whom they control or supervise. So with that being said, and now we know a couple of different types, what are some causes? And this doesn't by no means diminish anything. We're just talking about causes. So what factors predispose specifically men to rape? Now, criminologists' responses to this question are almost as varied as the crime itself. However, most explanations can be grouped into a couple of consistent categories. And in these categories would be evolutionary factors, or male socialization, or psychological abnormality, social learning, gender conflict, and sexual motivation. And we're just going to briefly touch on these. So, under evolutionary factors, according to the evolutionary psychology view, sexual violence may be instinctual, developed over the ages as a means of perpetuating the species. And again, I'm just giving you the information that falls under causes or groups in there. I'm not advocating or saying that, because some of these are kind of sometimes hard to get a grasp on. Male socialization, in contrast to the evolutionary biological view, some researchers argue that rape is a function of socialization. Some men have been socialized to be aggressive with women and believe that the use of violence or force is legitimate if their sexual advances are rebuffed, if that makes any sense. And those who have been socialized to believe that no means yes are more likely to be sexually aggressive. The next could be some type of abnormality. Rapists often have undergone a traumatic childhood marked by sexual abuse and parental detachment. Not surprisingly, many suffer from some type of personality disorder or mental illness, and many have psychotic tendencies, including hostile, sadistic feelings towards women. What about social learning? According to this perspective, men learn to commit rapes in much the same way they learn any other type of behavior. Sexual aggression may be learned through interaction with peers who articulate attitudes supportive of this type of sexual violence. What about gender conflict? According to the gender conflict view, as women make progress towards social, political, and economic equality, men fear them as a threat to their long-held dominance, and men react through efforts of formal and informal controls over women. One informal method of social control is to dominate women sexually through the commission of rape. What about sexual motivation? Even though criminologists now consider rape a violent act, sometimes without sexual motivation, there is evidence that at least some rapists have sexual feelings for their victims. So all of these, again, are in that little realm of different causes. Okay, not excuses, but causes. So what about rape and law? Because we have to talk about that if we're going to talk about all this other stuff. As you may recall back in chapter 3, the jury in the St. Paul rape case may have believed that the young victim consented to a sexual encounter, even though her testimony suggested the opposite. the jury doubted the veracity of her version of events that took place. Now, she's not alone, nor is her case unique. Unlike other victims, women may find that they have to prove that they didn't engage in consensual sex and then develop remorse afterwards. Research shows that people are more likely to blame the victim, if you will, in a case of sexual assault than they are to find than they are in other common law crimes like robbery. They don't blame the victim in a robbery, but they will in a sexual assault case. And victim blaming is exacerbated or heightened if a prior relationship existed or if the victim did not fight back because she was intoxicated or scared or whatever. Factors have less impact in other crimes. So this is kind of a tough situation here when you talk about it, and these cases are very difficult to prosecute as well. So we kind of talked about this one here, proving rape. On March 13, 2006, after a performance by two strippers at a private residence, 3 members of Duke University's men's lacrosse team were accused of raping one of the women who had been hired to entertain them. And however, evidence soon emerged that the charges were false and that the players were falsely accused. So another thing that kind of, when we talk about proving rape, sometimes we have these cases that go the other way, where it didn't happen the way that it was told, if that kind of makes sense. So proving rape can be tough. And here I have a couple of photographs of some of the things that came out in the newspaper as well. So before we get to consent, let's finish this up. So stories that, such as these that we talked about, the Duke thing, make proving guilt in a rape case extremely challenging by prosecutors. Some judges fear that women may charge men with rape or accuse them because of jealousy, withdrawn marriage proposals, revenge, or even pregnancy. And there is evidence that juries may consider the race of the victim and offender in their decision making. They may believe victims and convict defendants more often in interracial rapes than when both parties are the same race. Now, although the law doesn't recognize it, jurors are sometimes swayed by the insinuation that the rape was victim precipitated. Thus, the blame is shifted from the rapist to the victim. To get a conviction, then, prosecutors have to establish that the act was forced and violent and that no question of voluntary compliance existed at the time. And they may be reluctant to prosecute cases where they have questions about the victim's moral character, or if they believe the victim's demeanor and attitude will turn off the jury and undermine their actual chance of conviction. So again, kind of an uphill battle sometimes, which is extremely pitiful. Actually, it shouldn't be that way. But these are things that criminologists deal with a lot of time, and the criminal justice system deals with as well. So what about consent? So again, we're walking through all these different pieces here. So it is essential to prove that the attack was forced and that the victim did not give voluntary consent. In a sense, the burden of proof is on the victim to show that their character is beyond question and that they are in no way encouraged, enticed, or misled the accused. Now, there is some legal reform that's happened because of the difficulty that rape victims have in obtaining justice. Rape laws have been changing around the country, and reform efforts include changing the language of statutes, dropping the condition of victim resistance, and changing the requirement of use of force to include the threat of force or injury. And with that has emerged called shield laws, which protect women from being questioned about their sexual history unless it directly bears on the case. And that's become kind of universal, and it's kind of about time. So now that we've gone through the section on rape, and before we get into homicide, I think I'm going to break this up into two different lectures to make it a little easier for you to digest, because we're at about the 50-minute mark. So this will conclude the first half of the chapter 10 lecture. And when we come back to the second half, we are going to talk about murder and homicide. So again, this will conclude the first part of chapter 1.